Super. What I'd like to do today is share with you some insights that came from a recent report we've just launched, which is called Reimagining a New Economy That Serves People and Planet. And so we want to really share with you the insights that came from that report. And that was created by a coalition of willing, an independent coalition of willing, which is also unfunded, which is, I think, important. And that was deliberate so that there was no sort of institutional kind of bias. It was really just what emerged from the consensus of the group. And as we know, the stories we tell are really important. They shape the world around us and how we see our role in it. So the role, is really important about, what stories we're telling ourselves about the economy and our lives within it. So what we'll have lined up is in a moment, we'll have a presentation where I'll talk for about sort of 30 minutes, introducing the core concepts of the report and why it was created. Then we'll be getting into some small group discussion for around 10 minutes. And then what we'll do is we'll be coming back as a whole group to share insights as a whole group. So if we start then with looking at why is it that we need a new narrative? Well, many of you will have seen the just last week there was the summary of our planetary health check by the Potsdam Institute in Sweden, which showed that we're breaching seven of the nine environmental limits globally, and so we are undermining the only home we have. So we need urgent transformation to address that. We're halfway through the decisive decade, where after that, we risk running into escalating, cascading crises, and our ability to hold back that will be increasingly compromised. So we know we're getting the outcomes that we're not looking for, that the economy isn't working. And we also know the systems we need to transform, so there's food, energy, and so on. And we also know that no one actor can do that on their own. So we can't just leave this to business or governments. We also know that the old narratives around the economy and how it works is very well funded and very well organized. But meanwhile, there isn't necessarily a clear and credible alternative narrative. And as a consequence, we often lack the imaginative scaffolding to think, well, how would different economic actors operate in a new economy to help us pathfind a way towards that and to resolve some of these downstream solutions? So what we wanted to do partly through this project was surface what are those sort of upstream narratives and assumptions that then drive and influence policies, structures, that then in turn shape cultures, behaviors, and incentives that give us the outcomes we actually face today. And part of this is based on the premise that actually we know a huge amount about the new economy. There's loads of work being done on it, from the role of sustainable business, finance, new economy thinking. But like bits of a jigsaw puzzle, there's lots of them, but we don't necessarily have that picture on the top of the box. What does it all mean? How does it come together? And how is that a compelling alternative narrative? And so part of this project was really about an inquiry into, well, what are the common themes and principles of a new economy? And that's what I want to share with you. So I guess let's start off with then, what are those shared assumptions? Is it true that actually we all have, if there's 8 billion of us on the planet, are there 8 billion's view of what well-being is? Well, actually, evidence and surveys and it actually suggests no, there's a lot of consistency in what actually makes up well-being. That most people want to feel secure and part of healthy communities. They want meaningful, fairly paid work and time for loved ones and to lead a fulfilling life. They want access to clean air, energy, water, and housing. And they want to feel optimistic about the future and as if life is getting better for their children and their grandchildren and so on. However, the reality for the vast majority of us is very far removed from that. So really the downstream effects then of the current, if you like, old extractive economy that dominates in the world today is the reality is that many people feel exhausted. They're running like hamsters on a wheel. Often that they're working, the work they need to do in organizations are not aligned with their own personal values. They're anxious about growing inequality in society and the fragmentation of society and rising mental health issues and the epidemic of loneliness and this overconsumption of often take, make, waste products, and feeling anxious about climate and nature destruction. And also the fact that for the first time, really, in many even high income countries, that actually the living standards are falling and people are really anxious about the future generations. And so what we want to look at then is, well, what are the upstream causes, like a river? If that's the downstream effects where the river meets the sea, what are the upstream causes of that? Well, there are three fundamental flaws in the way we currently think about the dominant way of classical economics. The first is that we equate well-being with money, that money is seen as a proxy for well-being. But in fact, that misses the true drivers of well-being, both of nature and society, and we'll come on to that. Also, market reliance and overlooks the power of dynamics and influence of elites within those markets. And also, as eminent economist Professor Dasgupta has pointed out in the Dasgupta Review, we've separated the economy from ecology and society. We treat it as being separate entities rather than being fundamentally the whole of economy and society is reliant upon nature. And so what that leads to then is structures and policies that predominate where it's about governments are often maximizing growth because the assumption is growth leads to more well-being, and maximize markets because they seem to be the most efficient distributors of resources, and minimize state intervention. And both financial institutions are there to maximize financial value, and businesses are there to maximize profits. And we're all familiar with that story. But often what that's based on this idea, like the upward arrow, it's all about more, more financial growth, more power, more possessions. It's all about this sort of exponential growth. But the reality is that then leads to some midstream imperatives for particularly big businesses, whether it's private equity or publicly listed companies, that in order to maximize profits and financial value, they need to do three things to stay in business. The first is minimize labor. So they want as little labor working as much as possible to maximize labor efficiency, which can often lead to very transactional long hours culture. Also maximizing sales. So because often it's about sales revenue leads to profits, which is then being driven by advertising and so on, which is about creating insatiable demand for more products, whether we want them or not, and often leads to then overconsumption and increasingly take, make, waste, or built to break products. And then the third thing they need to do is externalize costs wherever they can. So whether that's things like pollution or social harm, things like the obesity epidemic being created by high sugar, high fat foods, but also minimizing corporate tax payments as well. And what that then leads to, in effect, is that bridges then into the downstream effects we experience because ultimately production shapes our lives, both on the demand side in terms of the products and services we have and are encouraged to buy, and on the supply side in terms of the labor market. So in both ways, it's sort of shaping that. And as states follow this approach and put more and more of the provision of goods and services into the market, this becomes more and more the shape of the economy. And so what that leads to then is a situation where we have this sort of vicious circle where because money is equal to well-being, that means businesses maximize profits, which then leads to those three imperatives that lead to the polycrisis. It leads to the fragmentation of society, increasing inequality, and the overconsumption of take, make, waste products and services, which is just undermining nature and the climate. And what that does is that's really in conflict with what we set out earlier as being true well-being, at least this fundamental different approach and outcome. Also, what that means, it leads to fragile economies where it leads to centralized power in the system, where we have these few large businesses which dominate value chains and often lead to very lean systems because anything that surplus is a potential cost and therefore lead to profit, which is actually leads to very fragile economies. And then also, meanwhile, the state is playing a role where they're needing to maximize their growth is the plan of that often states are encouraged to do, but also to minimize tax revenues, often influenced to do that in order to if people could unmute if you're not talking, that would be great, please. So, and so what that means is that often governments are encouraged to minimize the spending on public services, often at a time when they need to increase public services in order to cover some of those externalized costs coming from the private sector. And that's often then leading to indebted governments. And so the food industry is a good example of that today, where only 10% of the global population, or 10% is undernourished. Meanwhile, 1 in 8 adults are obese. So they're not necessarily leading to good nutritional outcomes. We've got centralized players. So four corporates control 90% of the global grain trade. And we also have even centralized diets where, as you can see, those four products account for 60% of 60% of the, oh, beg your pardon, nutrition that's grown by farmers. And there was some recent research done by the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity, which showed the British food system creates £286 billion of externalised costs, which is almost matching the NHS's budget. But also, as we've got centralized production, both countries and supply chain bottlenecks, that leads to this network density, which is actually very susceptible to cascading failures at a time when we actually need to increase food production by 35 to 56%. So what we end up with are, often value chains that are not aligned to, they're not resilient and they're not leading to well-being outcomes. And the risk is that if we carry on with more of the same, more of these same upstream design features leading to these downstream effects, we have this structural misalignment between economic incentives and well-being outcomes. And so the risk is in the 2030s, we start to hit cascading disruption. And as we hit over 33 degrees average temperatures, there are estimates that we'll be having between 3 to 4 billion climate refugees and deepening inequality and social collapse. But also, what this is likely to lead to is continually undermining markets in themselves and therefore undermining business interests, being able to sustain their value chains. And also, governments and businesses already are caught up in this firefighting cycle where anything, unless it's really delivering an immediate or putting out an immediate fire, is very difficult to get time, attention, or budget. There's also risk politically of a rise of populism, where the risk is that politicians are blaming the symptoms of those systems rather than the causes, leading to even more volatility and disruption. And the risk is that we'll face more of these outcomes unless we change the upstream design. So, in summary, the more we tend to focus on and assume that money equals well-being and that markets are only the most efficient distributors of resources, and we treat the economy as separate from people and planet, we'll have more policies that prioritize GDP growth as an end in itself, put more and more provisions to the markets, and pursue financial value, which in turn will lead to greater inequalities, more destruction of nature and climate, and destabilizing societies. So maybe it's time to actually question some of those core assumptions of how the economy operates, but without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, without losing the things that work well in the economy today. And many people think, well, you must mean communism, right? And that didn't work. Well, no, there's very much an alternative approach, but it's highly fragmented. And so that's again what I'd like to share with you now is what are some of those shared principles and practices that is what a new economy could look like. Because the reality is we need to imagine that new economy in order to move towards it, to imagine a new future. So March this year, a group of 30 both thought leaders and leaders from the economy came together in London to inquire into these shared principles and roles of actors. So, for example, we had Ben from the Ernst& Young, who did a load of great thinking on new economy unit. We've got Emmy Bidson, who works on the Oxford Character Project and the Harvard Flourishing Project. We had Professor Fergus Lyon from CUSP, who does a lot of great thinking about the future of the economy. Gail Harrington, who thinks and does a lot of speaking and talking on new economies based in the US. Joe Swinson, who is the Director of Partners for a New Economy. We had and also representatives from the Welsh and Scottish governments. Catherine Trebeck, co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is a great source of guidance and thinking on this whole new area. Sophie from the Economy of Common Good, and also Till from the Club of Rome, who provided some really early thinking back in the 70s about looking at the limits to growth and are still major thought leaders. And also Zhao Ting from Donut Economics Action Lab. Many of you will come across Kate Raworth's work. So, and we tried to be as inclusive as possible. We also fed in as much thinking from the global south as possible, people like Chandran Nair and others, and indigenous economics. And all of that sort of fed into the thinking and wanted to be, as I say, as inclusive as possible, but recognizing the people that were there were mostly from the Northern Hemisphere. We also had representatives from business, finance, and government. As I mentioned, from both the Scottish government, we had a chief economist, representative from the Confederation of British Industry. So people who really, are very, deeply engaged with the economy as it is today. So it's really grounded in that reality. So let's start with what would be the downstream effects then of life in a new economy? Well, the idea is we describe it as a plentiful life where you'd have more time for loved ones and to spend a fulfilling life. There'd be more jobs with better quality, where with a shorter working week, and they'd be more meaningful because they're delivering well-being outcomes. There'd also be less consumption, but higher quality products and services that last for longer. There'd also be greater innovation and business attraction of talent who are focusing on businesses and also state provision of well-being goods and services. And there'd be more net zero circular products and services. And because there'd be less pressure on public services to actually create those negative externalities from the economy, there'd be less pressure on public services, freeing up more time for positive investment into the economy and also less extreme inequality. There'd also like to be much greater local engagement in place where people can have a clearer sense of identity, where they can shape local priorities and be involved in their delivery, and having access to clean food, energy, water, and housing. And we have this idea of the infinity symbol that symbolized that, and that there's this sort of regenerative idea of how the economy would operate rather than that sort of upwards sloping arrow. Now we realize that this feels very far away from pretty much everybody today, not just in high income countries. So, what would be some of the upstream design features that might lead to those downstream effects? Well, the first thing is a recognition that people are part of nature and dependent on it and each other for their thriving as well as surviving. Also, that well-being lies therefore in the flourishing relationships between people and between people in the natural world, and that society in turn is a complex system embedded in the natural world. So, based on those core tenets, then the purpose of the economy would be to serve the long-term well-being of people and planet, arguably, which is the opposite of how it is today, where people and planet are often serving the economy. We also start to unpack what the role of those key actors are then in the economy to start to provide the imaginative scaffolding for how the economy might operate. So, first of all, as you can see here, civil society has a critical role in shaping well-being goals, working closely with governments to shape them and then actively engage in their delivery. Meanwhile, states actively involve communities to shape those, to understand what is long-term well-being and shape those well-being goals. That could operate at a city, region, or a state or national level, or indeed international, but also setting safe social and environmental parameters. And so that means things like setting environmental boundaries, like being net zero, restorative of nature, and also things like what level of inequality will be tolerated or permissible in the economy, and then crucially shapes markets to deliver this. So rather than purely free markets, we have this idea of bounded markets where businesses are still absolutely incentivized to be innovative and harness all of that power of the private sector to deliver well-being outcomes. But the state would also complement that with its own provision and investment, crowding in investment and scaling investment and activity towards those well-being outcomes. Businesses in turn would be incentivized through market mechanisms to provide those goods and services that deliver genuine well-being outcomes, and in the process would deliver meaningful work, which is fairly paid. And then meanwhile, finance would be funding those well-being economic activities in the real economy, as opposed to financing finance, which is what the majority of finance does today. And in the report, what we do is we unpack some of the key functions that each of those actors would play in more detail. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that, and we'd really welcome your feedback on that. And so what that leads to is a very different dynamic, which has this sort of, if you like, virtuous circles where because the state is setting purpose well-being goals and parameters, engaging citizens, where citizens feel a genuine sense of political participation, that then incentivizes purpose-led businesses to create genuine long-term value creation and feel like they're part of creating that long-term, being custodians of the future, creating meaningful, fairly paid work that are delivering well-being goods and services, which in turn are delivering well-being outcomes that are more aligned to what we set out at the beginning of the presentation, and creating strong communities, allowing time for flourishing, but also leading to more resilient economies because they're more diverse, decentralized. Meanwhile, states, having set those well-being goals in close relationship with civil society, would then structure markets and incentivize markets to deliver them. which would then shape well-being, shape those public services as well, or complement them, so that you have this positive investment and partnerships between public and private sector, where there's more of a balance of risk and reward, and then in terms of fueling and those well-being outcomes. So the principles of the Wellbeing Economy, as we found during the workshop, and this backed up some wider research that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance conducted, is that the economy is purpose-driven, so that based around those well-being goals that are delivering common good. Participation, where citizens are actively involved in both shaping and delivering those, and that the core is dignity, where it's designed to ensure that everyone has enough to live in comfort, safety, and happiness, and that fairness is right at the heart of the economy, and that the economy is designed to both restore and operate within natural limits that enables natural world to thrive. And so we see then these sort of fundamental shifts from the old extractive economy, because it's extractive of both raw materials, labor, and financial value, in this sort of exponential upward trajectory, to the kind of more plentiful life economy. So we're flipping isolation to connection, moving from scarcity to abundance, and from insecurity to security. And the other thing worth mentioning is that actually most people want a new economy. So research from these sources show that while in the high 80s and 90s, people are looking for either what they might call donut economic principles or taking decisive action on climate change. But interestingly, they only think that maybe 40 to 50% of their peers think the same. So we have this conspiracy of silence. But meanwhile, there's a huge amount of change happening already, and I'd encourage you to check out the Wellbeing Economy Alliance case study section as a really inspiring range. But coming back to food, Milan pioneered this international protocol aimed at involving cities in coordinating global food policies, which is now scaled up to over 210 cities around the world that are moving towards more inclusive and sustainable food systems. So huge amounts of activities already happening. But we need to be realistic about we need a huge gap that we are bridging between the realities that most people are feeling, both in the home, cost of living crisis and anxiety about the future, in businesses, the pressure to deliver commercial results, in finance to deliver those financial returns. That's the reality we're operating within every day. And we know it's a big gap out to what that future of the economy might be. But I'd suggest that what's helpful is to know where we're wanting to get to and start to create the imaginative scaffolding to imagine how economic actors could work together in order to build some of those transition pathways. So coming into land then, so what might this mean for you, just as maybe a provocation before we get into some small groups? So as employees and leaders, you might be thinking about do we setting well-being goals and parameters, either for your team, for your business, your department, or maybe the government or state you're operating within. How can you shape political aspirations, whether particularly if you're in government or through lobbying, and helping to shape and influence policy and regulation that creates genuine long-term value creation and well-being outcomes. But also, when working with other economic actors, say if you're in business and you're working with, say, governments or civil society groups or regulators, say in the food industry or whatever industry you might be in, how could you maybe use some of this content to challenge and inspire what other roles of economic actors are, rather than falling back into outdated ideas such as businesses are just chasing profit or it's only public money for public good? What are these new ways of thinking that can actually overcome those out of date polarities? How might you shape organizational purpose and strategy? And also calling out the current reality and the upstream drivers of that, rather than treating as if it's something like nature. It's not part of nature. Markets are not part of nature. They're made by people for people. And also, crucially, engaging with existing sectoral initiatives and shape those transition pathways rather than reinventing the wheel. But also, citizens, how might we create debate? With our networks, friends and family, having this discussion, calling out current reality, and also engaging with local community groups to get involved in delivering well-being outcomes and shaping them. How might we develop our inner capabilities, drawing on things like the inner development goals or things like character traits, like the Oxford Character Project sets out? And also using our voice, both politically, but also in how we invest our money and the products and services that we buy, are all ways of bringing about a new economy. So finally, I wanted to kind of share where this project is going next. So throughout the rest of 2025, we'll be testing a draft narrative. That's a group of amazing creatives that I was lucky enough to work with from the advertising industry to help take this insights from the report and say, how might we really land this with, senior leaders and employees and engaged citizens? How might we land this narrative? And we'll be testing that throughout this year, and then we'll be looking to publish that early next year. And then all throughout 2026, we want to be sharing it and creating debate. And as maybe an open invitation to yourself, you might want to think about how might you share this report with your networks and create debate in your networks. How might it inform your own practice if you're engaging with economic actors or shaping organizational strategy or, in your sphere of control and influence? We'd love to hear any feedback you have, either from yourself or your networks. But equally, if you have your networks you'd love to share this with, do let me know. I'd be really pleased to do that with you. You might want to consider writing something that shares what this whole agenda means to you, signposting your own work, either this year or next. And I'd really invite you also to share and promote the narrative when it comes out next year, because the whole idea is to create debate throughout this process. So now, what we'll be doing is we'll be getting into some breakout groups to have a conversation.